They say your life flashes before your eyes the moment you die. But when my world ended, there was no light, no memories of childhood summers, no cinematic reel of my greatest hits. There was only the cold, mechanical click of a locksmith changing the tumblers on the front door of the estate I had called home for 35 years. I stood on the manicured gravel driveway of the Sterling Manor in Greenwich, Connecticut, clutching a single weathered cardboard box. It was raining one of those miserable, bone-chilling October drizzles that seems to soak right into your marrow. Through the tall, leaded glass windows of the library, I saw them. My wife, Vivienne, and the man who had systematically dismantled my existence, Silas Vance. They weren't hiding anymore. Silas was pouring a glass of my 30-year-old scotch, his hand resting possessively on the small of Vivienne's back. She laughed a sound that used to be the music of my life, but now sounded like jagged glass scraping against a chalkboard. She didn't even look toward the window. To her, I was already a ghost. "You lost, Julian," she had whispered to me in the hallway of the courthouse just an hour prior, her voice devoid of the warmth that had once promised me forever. "You're an old man who doesn't realize the world has moved on. You have nothing left. No home, no reputation, and certainly no family." She was right. At 70 years old, I had been stripped bare. The $1 million in assets I'd spent 40 years accumulating, the houses in the Hamptons, the luxury SUVs, the Sterling Mercer investment accounts, had been signed over to her by a judge who looked at me like I was a predatory relic. Even my children, Audrey and Julian Jr., had looked at me with disgust before walking out of the courtroom behind their mother and her legal advisor. I was broke. I was humiliated. And I was standing in the rain with $74 in my pocket and a box of old papers I'd grabbed from the attic before the deputies escorted me out. I didn't know it yet, but the man standing in that driveway wasn't just a victim, he was a catalyst. And the box I was holding contained a secret that had been dormant since the Truman administration. I spent my first night of freedom in a roadside motel that smelled of stale cigarettes and desperation. I sat on the edge of a sagging mattress, the springs groaning under my weight, and stared at the cardboard box. My name is Julian Sterling. For 4 decades, that name meant something in the tri-state area. I was the man who built the Sterling Development Group from a single dilapidated warehouse in Brooklyn into a real estate empire that reshaped the New York skyline. I grew up in the shadows of the Great Depression's aftermath. My father was a man of few words and calloused hands, who taught me that a man's word was his currency. I started out selling life insurance in the rougher parts of Queens, wearing a suit I'd bought at a thrift store and shoes lined with newspaper to cover the holes in the soles. I walked until my feet bled, knocking on doors where people looked at me with suspicion. But I had a gift. I knew how to listen. I knew how to make people feel safe. By the time I hit 30, I had saved enough to buy my first multifamily unit. I spent my weekends stripping lead paint and fixing plumbing with my own hands. I didn't mind the sweat. I was building a legacy. When I met Vivienne at a charity gala in the city, I felt like the luckiest man alive. She was the daughter of an old-money family from Virginia, elegant, sharp, and possessed of a beauty that seemed to command the very air in the room. We were the it couple of the Greenwich social scene. We had the perfect children, Audrey, my brilliant daughter who followed in her mother's footsteps of high society grace, and Julian Jr., whom I groomed to take over the company. I gave them everything. I paid for Ivy League educations, European summers, and the best of everything money could buy. I thought I was buying their love. I thought I was building a fortress. But fortresses can be undermined from within, and I was too busy looking at the horizon to see the termites eating the floorboards. The change started 2 years ago. It was subtle at first, a coldness in Vivienne's eyes when she looked at me over dinner, the way she'd pull away if I tried to hold her hand. She started spending more time in the city, claiming she was involved in philanthropic ventures with a new legal firm. That firm was Vance Associates, and the man leading it was Silas Vance. Silas was everything I wasn't. He was 45, polished, and carried the kind of predatory ambition that hides behind a $5,000 Italian suit. He was a divorce specialist, though at the time, Vivienne introduced him as her business consultant. I welcomed him into our home. I shared my best cigars with him. I even gave him access to our private ledgers so he could optimize our estate tax exposure. I didn't realize I was handing a wolf the keys to the sheepfold. The betrayal wasn't just an affair, it was a surgical strike. Silas and Vivienne hadn't just been sleeping together. They had been documenting every moment of my life, twisting every conversation, and manufacturing a narrative of financial abuse and mental instability. They used the very documents I had trusted Silas with to create a paper trail that made it look like I was siphoning money into offshore. Accounts I had never even heard of. By the time the divorce papers hit my desk, the trap had already snapped shut. My children didn't even call me. When I tried to reach them, Silas's office sent me a cease and desist order. Vivienne told them I had been cheating on her for years, that I was planning to disinherit them, and that I had become a danger to the family. I watched my life dissolve in a series of court hearings, where Silas Vance smiled at me like a butcher watching a cow enter the slaughterhouse. He used every legal loophole, every forged document, and every ounce of Vivienne's fragile victim performance to convince a judge that I should be left with nothing. "It's for your own good, Julian," Vivienne had said during our final mediation, her voice cold. "You've lost your grip. We're just taking care of the legacy before you ruin it." Now, sitting in this motel room, the legacy was gone. I looked at the box of papers. Most of it was junk old tax returns, photos of the kids when they were small, things Vivienne didn't want cluttering her new life. But at the very bottom, tucked inside a moth-eaten wool sweater, was a small, leather-bound ledger that had belonged to my grandfather, Alistair Sterling. Alistair had been a merchant marine, a man of secrets who died when I was barely 20. He'd left me this box with a note that read, "In case the storm gets too loud, Julian." I'd ignored it for 50 years, assuming it was just sentimental ramblings. I opened the ledger. Inside, clipped to the yellowed pages, was a faded savings passbook from the Sterling Mercer Union Bank, the very bank I had helped take public 20 years ago. The last entry was dated June 8th, 1948, a deposit of $100. I chuckled bitterly, the sound echoing in the empty motel room. $100 from $100. Even with interest, it might be enough for a decent steak dinner and a new pair of socks. But as I flipped the pages, I saw something strange. There were no withdrawals, and there was a series of handwritten notes in my grandfather's cramped script about the long game and compound trust. The next morning, I didn't go to a lawyer. I didn't go to the police. I walked into the main branch of the Sterling Mercer Union Bank on 5th Avenue. I was wearing a threadbare coat and carrying that old passbook. The young teller looked at me with the kind of pitying tolerance reserved for the homeless and the delusional. "I'd like to check the status of this account," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "Sir, this looks ancient," she said, squinting at the passbook. "I'm not even sure these account numbers are still in our system. Let me call the manager." 10 minutes later, a man in his late 50s named Marcus Montgomery came out. He looked at the passbook, then looked at me. His face went through a rapid succession of expressions: confusion, skepticism, and then a sudden, jarring paleness. "Mr. Sterling?" he whispered. "Julian Sterling?" "That's me," I said. "Or what's left of him." "Please," Montgomery said, gesturing toward a private elevator. "We need to go to the executive floor. Immediately." The walk to the office was a blur. My heart was thumping against my ribs like a trapped bird. Montgomery sat me down in a mahogany-paneled room and started typing furiously into a terminal. He made 3 phone calls, his voice dropping to a low, urgent murmur. Finally, he turned the screen toward me. "Mr. Sterling, this account was established under a very specific, and now illegal, centennial compound clause in Mutngin Chin Trum Born Muitarm. Your grandfather wasn't just a sailor. He was a man who understood the power of time. He didn't just deposit Matrum Dola. He deposited Matrum Dola into a high-yield maritime trust that has been reinvesting in emerging technologies for 78 years. He swiveled the monitor. I leaned forward, my glasses sliding down my nose. I looked at the final balance line. My brain refused to process the digits. I counted the commas. Once, twice. "Is that Mochum Dola million?" I asked, my voice cracking. "Actually, sir," Montgomery said, his hands trembling as he handed me a printout. With the dividend yields from the tech boom in the late 90s that were automatically swept into the principal, the current balance is Motrum Ba Mui Born, Tom Trum Lair High, Born Trum Mui Mot, Dola and 62 cents. I sat back, the air leaving my lungs in a rush. I thought about Vivienne and Silas in my library. I thought about my children who had traded their father for a piece of a Mui Hai Dola million estate. They thought they had taken everything. They thought they had left me with zero. "There is a condition, Mr. Sterling," Montgomery added, his voice low. "Your grandfather left a letter with the bank's vault. It was only to be opened if the heir presented the book in a state of Dear Necessity. He handed me a sealed envelope, the wax stamped with a nautical anchor. I opened it with shaking fingers. The letter was short. Julian, if you are reading this, the world has tried to break you. Don't let it. Money is a tool, not a soul. Use this to find the truth. And remember, the most dangerous man is the one they think is already dead. Build your own storm. A cold, sharp clarity washed over me. The grief didn't vanish, but it was suddenly eclipsed by something much more powerful, a sense of mission. Silas Vance was a master of the legal system, but he had one fatal flaw. He believed he was the smartest man in every room because he had the most money. He didn't know the rooms were about to change. I looked at Montgomery. I want this kept entirely off book for 48 hours. I need a private security firm, a forensic accountant who hates Silas Vance, and a phone that can't be tracked. Of course, Mr. Sterling. But what are you going to do? I stood up, feeling the weight of the Sterling name return to my shoulders. But this time, it wasn't a burden. It was a weapon. I'm going to let them enjoy my house for a few more days, I said, a slow smile spreading across my face for the first time in years. Because when the storm hits, I want them to be right where I can see them. I walked out of the bank and into the bright New York sun. I didn't look like a multimillionaire. I looked like a broken old man in a cheap coat, and that was exactly what I needed them to see. I had Matrum Bamwe born do la million, and a letter from a dead man telling me to go to war. But as I stepped toward a waiting taxi, my phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a text from an unknown number. I opened it and felt my blood turn to ice. I know you went to the bank, Julian. Don't get any ideas. Silas already has the next phase planned. Check the news at SAW, home PM. My heart hammered. How did they know? I looked around the crowded street, feeling 1,000 eyes on me. I realized then that the betrayal wasn't over. It was just getting started. The text message burned a hole in my pocket as I hurried away from the bank, my pulse thrumming in my neck like a frantic drum. I didn't look back. I knew how Silas Vance worked. He didn't just win a case. He salt the earth his opponents until nothing could ever grow again. I caught my reflection in a shop window, a gray-haired man in a wrinkled coat, clutching a tattered cardboard box, and for a split second, I didn't recognize myself. I looked exactly like the broken shell Silas had spent 2 years carefully crafting. I slipped into a crowded subway station, doubling back through the turnstiles and switching trains twice. It was a move I'd learned from a security consultant years ago when the Sterling Group was fighting a hostile takeover. Paranoia is a heavy cloak, but in my world, it was the only thing that kept you dry. I finally checked into a nondescript boutique hotel in Chelsea, paying cash and using an old alias from my early land acquisition days. Once the door clicked shut, I collapsed against it, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I had Mutrumbamwe born do la million. I was theoretically one of the wealthiest men in the city again. But as I looked at the clock born, Muilum PM, the weight of that text message felt heavier than the fortune. Check the news at SAW, home PM. What could Silas possibly have left to take? He had my houses, my company, and my children. He'd already turned me into a pariah in the only social circles I'd ever known. I stared at the leather-bound ledger my grandfather had left me, trying to find the strength to face the next 90 minutes. My mind drifted back to the beginning, to the golden years before the rot set in. I remembered the night I met Vivian Harrison. It was Mutngin Chin Trum Tarmwe Chin, at a benefit for the New York Philharmonic. She was the quintessential Virginian aristocrat, the kind of woman whose ancestors probably shook hands with George Washington. I was the nouveau rich kid from Queens who had just flipped his first 10-story building. I thought I had won a prize. I thought marrying Vivienne was the final seal of approval on my success. I didn't realize until much later that I wasn't her partner. I was her project. She spent the first decade of our marriage polishing me. She changed my wardrobe, my accent, and the way I held a martini glass. She introduced me to the Sterling Mercer board members and the Hamptons elite, and I let her do it because I loved her. I loved the way she looked in the morning light, and I loved the family we were building. Audrey was our firstborn. She had Vivienne's sharp intellect and my drive. I remember the day she got her white coat at Yale. I cried so hard I ruined my silk tie. And then there was Julian Jr., or JJ, as we called him. He was quieter, a boy who preferred books to the boardroom, but I pushed him anyway. I wanted them to have the armor of prestige that I'd had to forge for myself. I thought I was protecting them. I didn't see that I was actually building the walls of my own prison. The early warning signs of the betrayal were there, buried like unexploded landmines in the history of our marriage. About 5 years ago, Vivienne started talking about legacy protection. She convinced me to move our primary assets into a series of complex was just for the children, Julian, she'd say, her voice as smooth as aged bourbon. We need to make sure they're looked after if anything happens to us. I trusted her implicitly. Why wouldn't I? We had shared a bed for 35 years. We had buried parents together. We had seen each other through the High Ngin Lair Tam crash. But looking back through the lens of Mutrum Bamwe Borndo La Million, I saw the patterns. Silas Vance didn't just appear out of thin air 2 years ago. I found a record in my old office files, a legal consultation Vivienne had booked with him nearly 6 years ago. She had been planning the long game long before I ever heard the name Vance. I looked at the hotel room clock. Muy p.m. The tension in the room was suffocating. I needed an ally. I couldn't go to Robert Montgomery at the bank for this. He was a financier, not a street fighter. I needed someone who knew the shadows. I picked up the burner phone Marcus Montgomery had provided and dialed a number I had memorized a decade ago. Yeah? A gravelly voice answered on the third ring. Jax? It's Julian Sterling. There was a long silence on the other end. Jax Blackwood was a former NYPD detective who had gone private after a disagreement with internal affairs. He was the kind of man who found things that didn't want to be found. Julian? I heard you were down for the count. The papers said you had a breakdown during the divorce. The papers were told what to say, Jax. I need you. I'm at a hotel in Chelsea. I have resources now. Real resources. And I think Silas Vance is about to drop a bomb at Saw. Hung PM. Vance is a snake, Julian. He's got half the DA's office in his pocket. If he's dropping a bomb, it's going to be radioactive. I'll be there in 20 minutes. While I waited for Jax, I turned on the television, the volume low. The local news was droning on about a water main break in Brooklyn. I sat on the edge of the bed, the grandfather's ledger open in my lap. I realized then that my grandfather Alistair hadn't just left me money. He had left me a warning. The pages were filled with notes about silent partners and the hidden hand. He had been betrayed too, by a man he called the Commodore. He spent his whole life building a secret fortress so his descendants wouldn't have to suffer the same fate. I didn't know it yet, but the Commodore's descendants were still out there. And they were closer than I thought. A sharp knock at the door startled me. I looked through the peephole and saw Jax Blackwood, tall, scarred, and wearing a leather jacket that had seen better decades. I let him in, and he immediately scanned the room for bugs. You look like hell, Sterling, Jax said, pulling a flask from his pocket and offering it. I shook my head. Good. You'll need a clear head for this. I did a quick scan on the way over. Vance has been bragging at the university club. He told a group of associates that today was the day he officially buried the Sterling name. How? I asked. He already took the money. He took the house. He didn't just want your money, Julian. He wanted your soul. He's obsessed with becoming the new king of Greenwich. And to do that, he has to make sure you can never, ever come back. Jax sat down and flipped open a laptop. He's been working with a whistleblower from your old firm. Someone who's willing to say you were cooking the books for years. But that's not the big hit. The big hit is personal. I looked at the clock. Numwitarm PM. My hands were shaking. I grabbed the remote and turned up the volume on the channel Born News. And in local news, the anchor began, her expression shifting into that practiced, serious mask, a shocking development in the fall of the Sterling Empire. We have obtained exclusive footage and documents that shed a new light on the patriarch, Julian Sterling. The screen cut to a grainy, black and white video. It was me, or someone who looked remarkably like me, in a hotel room I didn't recognize. I was arguing with a young woman, barely older than my daughter Audrey. The Julian in the video shoved her, his face twisted in a rage I had never felt in my life. Then the screen cut to Silas Vance, sitting in a plush leather chair, looking somber and regretful. It's a tragedy, Silas said to the camera, his voice dripping with faux sincerity. Vivienne and the children wanted to keep this private. They wanted to protect Julian's legacy. But when we discovered the evidence of his extracurricular violence and the embezzlement of his own children's trust funds, we had no choice but to step in. Julian Sterling isn't a victim of a divorce. He's a man who has been hiding a monstrous double life for 40 years. I felt the air leave my lungs. The video was a deepfake, a sophisticated, terrifyingly realistic fabrication. But the part about the trust funds, that was the next phase. He's framing me for stealing from Audrey and JJ, I whispered. He's going to make them hate me forever. He's going to make it so they can never even look at me without seeing a thief and a monster. Wait, Jack said, leaning into the screen. Look at the timestamp on that video, and look at the background. I squinted. The background of the assault video was a suite at the Pierre Hotel. The timestamp was October moi bornth of last year. Jax, I said, a cold realization washing over me. I was in London on October moi bornth. I was at a board meeting for the Sterling Mercer Group. There were 20 witnesses. Silas knows that, Jax said grimly. He doesn't care about the truth. He cares about the first impression. By the time you prove this is fake, your children will have already signed the documents giving him full control over their remaining shares of the company. It's a sweep, Julian. He's liquidating you. But as I watched Silas Vance's smug face on the screen, something inside me snapped. The silly old fool Vivienne had joked about was gone. In his place was the man who had built an empire from a single warehouse in Brooklyn. I looked at the ledger in my lap, then at the printout from the bank. Motrumba moi born do la million. Jax, I said, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. How much would it cost to buy the building Silas Vance lives in? Jax looked at me, a slow, predatory grin spreading across his face. The Kensington Tower? It's owned by a holding company out of Jersey. Probably 60, 70 million. Buy it, I said, through an anonymous shell company. And Jax? Hire the best digital forensic team in the country. I want that video dismantled frame by frame, but don't release the proof yet. What are you planning, Julian? I stood up, the old fire back in my eyes. Silas thinks he's playing a game of checkers. He thinks he's already won because he has the board. But he forgot one thing. What's that? I'm the one who built the table. I walked over to the window, looking out at the city I had helped shape. The betrayal stung, yes. The sight of my children's faces when they eventually saw that fake news report would be agonizing. But Silas had made a tactical error. He had left me with a box of my grandfather's secrets and a bank account he didn't know existed. What happened next would change the power structure of this city forever. But as I turned away from the window, I saw a shadow move in the reflection of the glass. A red laser dot appeared on the wall right next to my head. Jax, get down, I screamed. The window shattered in a spray of diamonds as a high-caliber round tore through the room, missing my skull by an inch. I didn't know it yet, but Silas wasn't just trying to bury my name anymore. He was trying to bury me. The silence in the immediate aftermath of the gunshot was louder than the blast itself. For a heartbeat, the only sound was the tinkling of glass shards falling onto the hardwood floor like frozen rain. Jax didn't hesitate. He tackled me, his weight slamming me into the carpeted floor just as a second round tore through the headboard of the bed, sending a plume of white feathers into the air. Don't move. Stay low. Jax hissed, his voice a gravelly command. He didn't look like a private investigator anymore. He looked like a soldier. He pulled a compact handgun from his waistband and crawled toward the wall beside the shattered window, his movements fluid and practiced. I lay there, chest heaving, the smell of gunpowder and old dust filling my lungs. I was a 70-year-old man who had spent his life fighting over boardrooms and real estate contracts. I wasn't prepared for the smell of my own potential death. My heart was a frantic bird trapped in a cage of ribs, and for a moment, the Motrumba moi born do la million in the bank felt as light and useless as the feathers floating in the air. He's gone, Jax muttered after a tense minute, lowering his weapon but staying clear of the sightline. Rooftop across the street. He's a pro. He saw us drop and he didn't stick around to play. We have 3 minutes before the NYPD gets here, and we can't be here when they do. Why? I managed to wheeze out. I'm the one they shot at. Think, Julian. Who do you think called the tip in? Jax grabbed my grandfather's ledger and the bank printouts, stuffing them into his jacket. The cops come in, find the disgraced Julian Sterling with a high-priced PI and a burner phone, and suddenly the headline isn't "Sniper Attacks Victim," it's "Embezzler Julian Sterling Involved in Underground Shootout." Silas owns the narrative. We need to leave. Now. He hauled me up and pushed me toward the service stairs. We moved through the back alley, the cold drizzle stinging my face, and into a nondescript black sedan parked 2 blocks away. As Jax peeled away from the curb, I looked back at the hotel. Sirens were already wailing in the distance. I didn't know it then, but the betrayal that led to those bullets didn't start with a court order. It started with a dinner 4 years ago, the night I celebrated my Sarmuisoth birthday. I leaned my head back against the leather seat, closing my eyes as the city lights blurred past. Back then, I thought I was at the pinnacle of my life. We were at the Harrison Club Vivienne's ancestral playground, and the table was filled with the elite of Greenwich. Silas Vance had been there as a guest of a business associate. I remember the way he looked at Vivienne. It wasn't the look of a consultant, it was the look of an appraiser. And Vivienne? She was glowing, her green eyes reflecting the candlelight, laughing at every joke Silas made while I sat at the head of the table, footing the haimui, hongdola bill. I should have seen the distance growing between me and my children that night. Audrey, my brilliant doctor, had spent the entire evening talking to Silas about modernizing her medical practice's investments. Julian Jr. was mesmerized by Silas's stories of high-stakes litigation. I was the old guard, the man who believed in slow growth and handshakes. Silas was the disruptor. "Dad, you're just so traditional," JJ had told me when I questioned Silas's aggressive tactics. The world doesn't work on honor anymore. It works on leverage. He was 24, and I had already lost him to the lure of easy power. I didn't realize that Silas was feeding them a slow poison, making them believe that my caution was actually senility, that my integrity was actually a lack of ambition. "Where are we going?" I asked Jax, shaking off the memory. "A safe house in Queens. An old property I keep off the books. Silas won't find us there, but we need to move fast. He's already started the liquidation of your kids' trusts." I looked at the burner phone. I wanted to call them. I wanted to scream at Audrey and JJ to wake up, to see the man who was currently sleeping in their father's bed for what he truly was. But I knew they wouldn't listen. To them, I was the man in that deepfake video. I was the monster. "Jax, the video," I said, my voice hardening. "How long to prove it's a fake? My guy is working on it." "But Julian, even if we prove the video is a deepfake, the damage to the trust funds is already done. Silas had them sign protective management agreements this morning. He has total signatory power over the Sterling Development Group's voting shares. He's going to announce a merger with Vance Holdings tomorrow morning at Chin, Kung AM. A merger. That was the play. Silas would absorb my life's work into his shadowy firm, strip the assets, and leave my children with nothing but a pile of devalued stock, while he and Vivienne vanished into a tax haven. He wasn't just stealing my money, he was stealing my children's futures to fund his own. "He thinks I'm hiding," I whispered, clutching the leather-bound ledger. "He thinks he's hunted me into a corner." "Isn't that what's happening?" Jax asked, glancing at me in the rearview mirror. "No, he's just cleared the board for me." I opened the ledger to the back page. Under a flap of loose leather, I found a series of numbers, not bank accounts, but GPS coordinates and a name, the Blackwood Foundry. "Jax, look at this," I said, showing him the page. Jax slowed the car, his eyes widening. "Blackwood? That's my family name. My grandfather was a steelworker in the Bourne Meuse. He always talked about a silent partner who saved his shop from the mob. My grandfather wasn't just a merchant marine, Jax. He was a financier for the invisible men of this city. The men Silas Vance thinks don't exist because they don't have Instagram accounts or entries in the social register. I realized then that the Moat Trum Bamwi Born Dola million wasn't just a pile of cash. It was a war chest. And my grandfather had left me a map of allies that Silas Vance's new money arrogance would never see coming. We arrived at the safe house, a weathered brick building in Astoria that looked like a forgotten relic of the industrial age. Inside, the walls were covered in monitors and maps. This was Jax's real office. "All right, Julian, you want to buy the Kensington Tower? I've already put out the feelers through a shell company in the Cayman Islands. The owners are desperate. They've got a massive balloon payment due on Friday. We can snatch the deed for Saumwilam Dola million by tomorrow afternoon." "Do it," I said. "And I want a meeting with the Sterling Mercer board. Not the ones Silas bought. The ones who remember what my name stands for. They won't see you, Julian. You're radioactive. They'll see the man who just bought their outstanding debt," I replied. "Use the trust. Buy every distressed bond Sterling Mercer has issued in the last 5 years. I want to be their biggest creditor by sunrise." For the next 6 hours, we worked in a fever dream of high finance warfare. I watched the numbers move on the screen, millions of dollars flying across the globe like silent birds of prey. It was exhilarating and terrifying. For 40 years, I had played by the rules. I had filed my taxes, followed the zoning laws, and respected the gentleman's agreements. Silas Vance had taught me that those rules were just suggestions for the powerful. So, I stopped being a gentleman. Ba, Hong AM, the digital forensics expert, a twitchy kid named Vane, burst into the room. "I got it. The deepfake, it's good, really good, but the guy who made it was lazy. He used a base layer from a Swedish adult film and mapped your face over it." I found the original source code. And check this out. The metadata on the upload? It came from an IP address registered to a guest suite at the Sterling Manor. I felt a cold shiver. The video hadn't been made in some dark basement. It had been made in my own house, while I was sleeping in the room next door. Vivian had watched me sleep while she helped Silas craft the lie that would destroy me. Save it, I told Vane. Don't release it yet. I want Silas to stand on that stage tomorrow morning. I want him to feel the weight of his victory. I want him to look my children in the eye and tell them he's their savior. You're playing a dangerous game, Sterling, Jax warned. If he suspects you're counterattacking, he'll send more than one sniper next time. Let him, I said. He's already taken my life. Now I'm just deciding how to spend his. I sat back, exhaustion finally pulling at my eyelids. I thought of JJ and Audrey. I remembered JJ's 10th birthday when I'd bought him a telescope. We'd spent the whole night on the roof of the Greenwich house, looking for Saturn. I'll always be watching over you, JJ, I'd promised. I was going to keep that promise, even if he hated me for it. Just as I was about to drift off, the burner phone buzzed. A new message. Not a text this time. An image. I opened it and felt the room spin. It was a photo of my daughter Audrey, leaving her clinic. Behind her, barely visible in the reflection of a car window, was the man from the hotel, the sniper. He wasn't looking at her, he was looking at his watch. Under the photo was a single sentence. The merger happens at Chin, Hong AM, Julian. If you aren't there to sign over the final patents, Audrey doesn't make it to her Mui, Hong AM surgery. Your move, old man. I looked at Jax, my face ghost white. Silas wasn't just liquidating my company anymore. He was holding my daughter's life as collateral for a signature. Jax, I whispered, the weight of the Mot Trumba Mui Born Dola million suddenly feeling like lead. He has Audrey. I looked at the clock. Born. Mui Hai AM. 5 hours until the merger. 5 hours to save my daughter from the man my wife had chosen over me. But as I looked at the ledger one last time, I saw a note I'd missed. A name written in the margin, next to Silas Vance's father's name. The betrayal didn't start 4 years ago. It started before I was even born. We're not going to the meeting, Jax, I said, my voice shaking with a new kind of rage. We're going to the manor. That's suicide, Julian. The place is crawling with Vance's security. No, I said, standing up. It's home. And I know every secret passage in that house. It's time to show Silas Vance what happens when you try to steal a Sterling's soul. But as we ran for the car, I didn't see the black SUV pulling up to the curb. I didn't see the flash of the flashbang grenade until it was too late. The world went white, and the last thing I heard was Silas Vance's voice, cold and mocking. Did you really think it would be that easy, Julian? You always were a slow learner. The world didn't come back all at once. It returned in painful, jagged pulses of white light and the high-pitched whine of a tea kettle that wasn't there. My head felt like it had been used for batting practice, and my lungs burned with the acrid aftertaste of the flashbang. I tried to lift my hands to rub my eyes, but they wouldn't move. A cold, metallic bite around my wrists told me everything I needed to know. I wasn't in a jail cell. I was in a place far more haunting. As my vision cleared, I recognized the gold leaf molding and the scent of expensive beeswax and old books. I was in the library of Sterling Manor, my library, or at least the room that used to be mine. I was strapped to a heavy Queen Anne chair, the one my father had given me when I closed my first $1 million deal. Welcome back to the land of the living, Julian. You always did have a thick skull. Silas Vance stood by the fireplace, the orange glow of the embers dancing in his predatory eyes. He had traded his tactical gear for a silk smoking jacket, looking every bit the lord of the manor. Beside him stood Vivienne, draped in a charcoal cashmere wrap, holding a crystal glass of sherry. She wouldn't look at me. She was staring at a painting above the mantel, a portrait of my grandfather, Alistair, that she had always hated. Where is Jax? I rasped, my throat feeling like I'd swallowed a handful of dry sand. Mr. Blackwood is currently being detained in the carriage house, Silas said, stepping closer. He reached out and adjusted my tattered coat with a mocking flick of his fingers. He's a resilient man, but my security team is remarkably persuasive. It's a shame, really. You chose a dinosaur to protect you in a world of drones and algorithms. You killed him. I choked out, a wave of nausea rolling over me. Not yet, Silas smiled, and the coldness of it chilled me more than the October rain ever could. He's leverage, just like your lovely daughter. My heart stuttered. If you touch Audrey— Oh, Julian, stop the theatrics, Vivienne snapped, finally turning her gaze toward me. Her eyes were hard, devoid of a single shred of the 35 years we had shared. No one is touching Audrey. At least, not yet. She's currently in the sunroom with JJ, under the impression that you finally suffered a nervous collapse and were brought here for a private medical evaluation. They're terrified for you, Julian. They think you've lost your mind. You told them I'm crazy? I asked, a bitter laugh bubbling up in my chest. After the deepfake? After the embezzlement frame-up? You're really leaning into the Senile patriarch routine, aren't you? It's the most believable narrative, Silas intervened, leaning against my desk, the desk where I had signed the papers that built half this town. The broken tycoon, driven to madness by his own failings, desperately trying to kidnap his daughter to save her from a non-existent threat. It's poetic, in a way. But we're here for business, Julian. The merger happens in 4 hours. I need your signature on the Sterling Mercer proprietary patents, the ones held in your private name, not the company's. I stared at him. The patents. They were the heart of my development group, the eco-thermal cooling systems and modular structural designs I'd spent 20 years perfecting. They were worth hundreds of millions on the open market. They weren't just assets, they were my legacy. I'll never sign, I said, my voice gaining strength. You've taken the house, the cash, and my reputation. But those patents stay with me. They're the only thing you can't forge. Silas sighed, a sound of exaggerated disappointment. He walked over to the library doors and opened them. Audrey? He's a bit confused, but perhaps you can talk some sense into him. My children walked in, and the look on their faces shattered what was left of my heart. Audrey, my brilliant, brave daughter, had dark circles under her eyes. Jay, looked like he hadn't slept in a week. They didn't see their father, the man who had taught them to swim in the Long Island Sound. They saw a criminal, a man who had shamed their name. Dad, Jay said, his voice trembling. Please, Silas told us about the sniper. He told us you hired a private investigator to stage a fake attack on yourself just to get Vivian's attention. He showed us the wire transfers to that Blackwood man. I looked at Silas. The brilliance of his manipulation was terrifying. He hadn't just faked the attack. He had made it look like I was the one who staged it. He was making me the villain of my own attempted murder. Audrey, listen to me, I pleaded, leaning toward her as much as the restraints would allow. The video was a deep fake. Silas and your mother, they've been planning this for years. I have proof. I have a bank account. Stop it, Dad, Audrey cried, the tears finally breaking through. Just stop the lying. We saw the documents. We saw the secret accounts where you were dumping our trust money. You were going to leave us with nothing. Silas is the only reason the company hasn't collapsed already. He's trying to save our future, and you're trying to burn it all down because your ego can't handle a divorce. She looked at me with pure, unadulterated loathing. You're not the man I thought you were. You're just a bitter old man who would rather destroy his children than lose his control. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. I looked at Vivienne, who was sipping her sherry with a look of bored triumph. I looked at Silas, who was watching me like a scientist watching a bug under a microscope. I realized then that the truth didn't matter. Not right now. In this room, Silas was the god of their reality. He had built a cage made of lies, and my children had walked into it willingly, locking the door behind them. Sign the patents, Julian, Silas said softly. Sign them, and I'll let you go. I'll give you a modest stipend enough to live out your days in a nice facility in Arizona. You'll be comfortable. You'll be forgotten, and your children will never have to deal with the shame of your public trial. And if I don't? Silas leaned in close, his voice a lethal whisper that the children couldn't hear. Then I released the rest of the evidence. The files that show you weren't just embezzling, but that you were involved in the accidental death of that young foreman back in Chinwe-Born. Remember him? The one whose family you paid off? I have the receipts, Julian. I'll send you to a state prison where a man of your age won't last a week, and I'll make sure Audrey loses her medical license for conspiring with you. Is that the legacy you want? I froze. The foreman. It had been a tragic accident, a structural failure on a Brooklyn site. I hadn't killed him, but I had paid for his children's education and made sure his widow was taken care of for life. Silas had twisted a gesture of guilt-ridden charity into a murder plot. I looked at my grandfather's portrait. The most dangerous man is the one they think is already dead. I had Matrumbamui-born $1 million in a bank Silas didn't know about. I had a PI who might still be alive, and I had a secret. I'll sign, I said, my voice sounding hollow and defeated. Vivienne let out a long, theatrical sigh of relief. Thank God. Finally, a moment of sanity. Silas produced the documents and a fountain pen. He signaled for his guards to loosen one of my hands. I gripped the pen, my fingers cramped and cold. As I leaned over the desk to sign, I caught a glimpse of a file folder lying open near the edge of the mahogany surface. It was an old, yellowed document, much like the ones in my grandfather's box. At the top of the page was a name, Harrison Vance Holdings, Mutngin Chintrum Bornwe Buyer. My heart skipped a beat. Vivienne's maiden name was Harrison. Silas's last name was Vance. I had always assumed they were from different worlds, the Virginia aristocrat and the New York shark. But looking at that paper, I saw a ledger entry for a dissolved partnership. My grandfather, Alistair Sterling, had been the one to sign the dissolution. He hadn't just ousted a partner. He had ruined 2 families to build the Sterling empire. The betrayal hadn't started with Vivienne's boredom or Silas's greed. It was a blood feud. They hadn't found each other by accident. They were the leftovers of a 70-year-old grudge, coming back to reclaim what they thought was stolen from their grandfathers. I signed the papers. My hand didn't shake. "There," I said, leaning back. "It's done. You have the company. You have the patents. Now get them out of here. I want to talk to Vivienne, alone." Silas took the papers, checking the signature with greedy eyes. He nodded to the children. "Audrey, JJ, why don't you head back to the guest house? Your father needs a moment with your mother. We'll announce the merger in the morning." My children left without a backward glance. Jay wouldn't even look at me. Audrey just shook her head, her disappointment a physical weight in the room. When the door clicked shut, leaving only me and Vivienne, the mask of the grieving wife finally slipped. She walked over to me and slapped me not a theatrical blow, but a cold, stinging strike that left the taste of copper in my mouth. "That was for making this so difficult, Julian," she hissed. "You were supposed to just fade away. You were supposed to be the dignified loser, but you had to go digging. You had to bring in that Blackwood animal. It was never about the money for you, was it, Vivienne?" I asked, spitting a bit of blood onto the Persian rug. "It was about the Harrison name. My grandfather took your family's land in Bornwe Tarm. He took the Vance family's foundry, and you've spent your whole life pretending to love the grandson of the man who ruined you, just waiting for the chance to take it back." Vivienne's face contorted into something ugly and ancient. "My father died a broken man because of the Sterlings. He worked in one of your grandfather's factories as a floor manager while you grew up in silk diapers. Silas's father jumped off the George Washington Bridge because your family called in a debt they knew he couldn't pay. So no, Julian, it wasn't about the money. It was about seeing you on your knees in the house your grandfather stole from mine." "Well," I said, a slow dark grin spreading across my face despite the pain. "You got what you wanted. You have the house. You have the company. And what do you have, Julian?" She sneered, leaning down so her face was inches from mine. "You have a cardboard box and a motel receipt." "I have one thing you forgot to check, Vivienne," I whispered. "And what's that?" "The property taxes on this manor. You see, when Silas optimized the estate through those trusts, he forgot to check the original Mutngin Chintrum Bornwe Tarm deed. The one my grandfather restructured after the Harrison buyout." Vivienne frowned, a flicker of doubt crossing her eyes. "What are you talking about?" "The manor isn't owned by the Sterling Development Group, Vivienne. It's owned by the Alistair Sterling Heritage Trust, a trust that can only be dissolved if the heir is dead or if a century clause is triggered. And Silas just triggered it by filing that merger." I looked at the clock on the wall. Muy lam PM. "I didn't just sign away my patents, Vivienne. I signed a consent to audit for the entire trust." "And do you know who the primary auditor is for the Heritage Trust?" Before she could answer, the library doors didn't just open, they were kicked in. But it wasn't the police. It was a team of men in dark suits, led by a man I hadn't seen in 20 years. He was the head of the Sterling Mercer Internal Security, a man whose loyalty I had bought with a life-changing favor decades ago. And behind him, looking battered but very much alive, was Jax Blackwood. "I told you, Julian," Jax said, wiping blood from his lip as he stepped into the room. "The Blackwood foundry never forgets a debt." Vivienne backed away, her face turning a ghastly shade of white. "What is this? Silas?" Silas is currently busy," Jax said. "He's being informed that the merger he just signed is actually a legal admission of predatory fraud. You see, Vivienne, Julian didn't just sign the patents. He signed them with a signature that matches the one in his senility files. A signature that, according to your own court testimony, is legally invalid." I stood up, the restraints falling away. Jax had palmed me the key when he'd been detained earlier. I had known he would get out. I had known he was the only man who could navigate the manor's old coal tunnels. You thought I was a slow learner, Vivienne, I said, walking toward her. But I've been playing the long game since before you were born. You wanted the house? You can have it. But you're going to have to share it with the federal marshals who are currently pulling into the driveway. I walked over to the desk and picked up my grandfather's ledger. But as I turned to leave, I saw Silas Vance standing in the doorway. He wasn't running. He was holding a remote control. You think you've won, Julian? Silas said, his voice eerily calm. You think a few lawyers and a washed-up cop can stop 70 years of momentum? This house is rigged with more than just memories. If I don't walk out of here with those patents, no one walks out. He pressed a button, and a low, rhythmic thumping began beneath our feet, the sound of a timer. I'm not losing to a sterling twice, Silas hissed. I looked at Jax. I looked at the panicked Vivienne, and then I thought of my children in the guest house. I didn't know it yet, but the rock bottom I thought I'd hit, it was just a false floor. The real fall was about to begin. The sound coming from beneath the floorboards wasn't the ticking of a clock. It was the heavy, rhythmic thud of the industrial furnace system being pushed into a thermal redline. I knew that sound. I had designed the basement specifications myself 30 years ago. Silas wasn't just threatening us. He was overriding the safety protocols of the manor's boilers. In 10 minutes, the pressurized steam would turn this multi-million-dollar masterpiece into a pile of brick and splintered mahogany. You're insane, Vivienne whispered, her voice cracking as she stared at the man she had traded her soul for. Silas, my children are in the guest house. This library. Everything we fought for. You're going to destroy it? Silas didn't even look at her. His gaze remained fixed on me, a terrifyingly calm smile on his face. I'm a Vance. Vivienne, we don't build empires. We survive them. If I can't have the sterling patents, the real ones, with your valid signature, Julian, then I'm going to make sure there's nothing left for the historians to dig up. I'll be halfway to a non-extradition country before the smoke clears, and you'll all be the tragic victims of a distraught patriarch's final act of arson. I looked at Jax. He was coiled like a spring, weighing the distance between him and Silas. But Silas had the remote held high, his thumb hovering over a second button. Don't even think about it, Blackwood. One twitch and I accelerate the cycle. We go from 10 minutes to 10 seconds. The betrayal was finally absolute. It wasn't just about a 70-year-old grudge anymore. Silas was a predator who had outgrown his leash. He didn't care about the Harrison family name or Vivienne's ancestral pride. He was a scorched-earth capitalist who viewed people as depreciating assets. Dad? Mom? What's happening? The library doors pushed open, and Audrey and JJ stood there, their faces pale and confused. They had heard the shouting, the thumping from the basement. Behind them, two of Silas's private security guards stood like statues, but I could see the sweat on their brows. Even they knew something had gone horribly wrong. Audrey, JJ, get out. Go to the driveway, now. I shouted, struggling against the chair. Silas laughed, a dry, hollow sound. Stay right where you are, kids. Your father was just about to sign a new set of papers, a set that actually holds up in court. He's going to save your lives, and in exchange, he's going to give me everything he's been hiding. I didn't know it yet, but the next 5 minutes would be the most humiliating of my life. Silas walked over to me, grabbed me by the hair, and forced my head back. He held a new document in front of my face, a total power of attorney, granting him control over every trust, every account, and every shell company associated with the sterling name. I know about the Motrumba muy borndo la million, Julian, Silas whispered in my ear, his breath smelling of expensive gin. My heart stopped. The bank. Marcus Montgomery. How? Did you really think the manager of a Sterling Mercer branch wouldn't report a 9-figure movement to the board? Silas chuckled. The board I currently chair? You're an amateur, Julian. You've been playing with pennies while I've been mapping the gold mines. Sign the POA, or I press the button. I'll kill your children, I'll kill your ex-wife, and I'll walk out of here with the narrative that I tried to save you all from your own madness. I looked at Audrey. She was staring at Silas with a dawning horror, the scales finally falling from her eyes. She saw the hair-pulling, the mockery, the cold-blooded calculation. She saw that the hero, who had rescued her from her father's instability, was a monster who was currently holding her life hostage for a bank balance. Let them go, Silas, I said, my voice thick with a humiliation that burned worse than the ropes on my wrists. You want the money? It's yours. Just let the children walk to the gate. Sign first, then they walk. I looked at Vivienne. She was slumped against the mantel, sobbing silently. She had realized, far too late, that she hadn't been the mastermind. She had been the lure. Silas had used her hatred for my family to get close enough to see the vault, and now he was going to blow the vault with her inside it. I took the pen. My hand was shaking so violently I could barely grip the barrel. I felt like a failure. I had found Matrum Bamwe born Dola million, a literal gift from the grave, and I had managed to lose it in less than 24 hours. I was 70 years old, and I was being broken in my own home, while my children watched. "I'm sorry, Audrey," I whispered as I touched the pen to the paper. "I'm so sorry, JJ." "Don't do it, Dad," JJ yelled, trying to lung forward, but one of the guards grabbed him, slamming him against the doorframe. "Sign it," Silas screamed, his composure finally snapping. The thumping from the basement was growing faster, a high-pitched metallic screeching starting to echo through the vents. The house was screaming. I signed. Every letter of my name was a nail in the coffin of my legacy. I pushed the paper toward him, my head bowing in total defeat. Silas snatched it up, his eyes gleaming with a manic light. "Perfect," Silas said. He looked at the remote. "Now, as for the walking to the gate part, I think I'd prefer a little more insurance." He backed toward the hidden service door behind the bookshelf, the one that led to the garage. "Vivienne, you stay here. Keep the family together. I'll send word once I've cleared the perimeter." "Silas?" Vivienne gasped, reaching out a hand. You can't leave us here. The system is going to blow." "Consider it a divorce settlement, Vivienne," Silas said, his voice as cold as a tombstone. "You wanted the Sterling Manor. Now you're going to be a permanent part of it." He disappeared through the door, and we heard the heavy iron bolt click from the other side. He had locked us in. The screeching from the vents reached a crescendo. The floorboards were becoming hot to the touch. Jax, who had been waiting for the split second Silas was gone, threw himself at the library doors. The guards Silas had left behind were already running for their lives, abandoning their posts. "The doors are jammed from the outside," Jax yelled, slamming his shoulder into the oak. "He must have triggered the security shutters." Iron screens hissed down over the windows, plunging the library into a terrifying, red-lit gloom. We were in a pressurized oven. "The coal tunnel," I shouted, finding a reserve of strength I didn't know I had. "Jax, the tunnel behind the Alistair portrait. It's the only way out that doesn't go through the main foyer." Jax didn't waste time. He ripped the portrait of my grandfather off the wall, revealing a small, dusty iron door. He kicked it open, and a draft of cool, damp air hit us. "Audrey, Jay, get in there. Go, go, go," I barked. I turned to Vivienne. She was still sitting on the floor, staring at the spot where Silas had vanished. She was catatonic, her mind unable to process the level of betrayal she had just endured. She had given him everything, and he had left her to burn with the man she hated. "Vivienne, move." I grabbed her by the arm, hauling her up. She looked at me, and for the first time in years, I saw the girl I had married, the one who laughed when I spilled wine on the tablecloth. The bitterness was gone, replaced by a hollow, haunting realization. "He never loved me, Julian," she whispered. "He never even liked me." "I know," I said, shoving her toward the tunnel. "Now move, or we both die here." We scrambled through the narrow, brick-lined passage, the sounds of the manor's destruction echoing behind us. The heat was intense, the smell of scorched insulation filling the air. We were halfway through when the first explosion rocked the ground. The walls of the tunnel groaned, dust and mortar raining down on us. "Keep moving," Jax's voice boomed from the front. We burst out into the cool night air near the old stone well at the edge of the property, just as the main roof of Sterling Manor collapsed in a spectacular plume of fire and debris. The sound was like a mountain falling. I stood there, supported by my children, and watched 40 years of my life vanish into the night sky. Audrey was sobbing, her head on my shoulder. Jay was holding my hand, his grip so tight it hurt. We were alive. But as the fire trucks began to wail in the distance, I looked at the dark road leading away from the estate. Silas was gone. He had the POA. He had the Matrumbamwe born Dola million. He had the patents. He had won everything. "He's going to get away," JJ whispered, watching the embers rise. "He has the papers, Dad. He has the money." "No," I said, a cold, hard stone forming in the pit of my stomach. "He has the papers I signed tonight. But he forgot one thing about the Sterling Mercer Union Bank." "What's that?" Jax asked, looking at me with bloodshot eyes. "The account my grandfather left me." It's not just a savings account. It's a ghost ledger. Every transaction made through that POA triggers an automatic fraud alert to the International Monetary Fund. Silas didn't just steal my money, he just stepped into a digital bear trap that's been waiting since Mutngin Chintram Bornwe Tarm. But as I said it, I felt a sharp pain in my chest. The world began to tilt. The stress, the smoke, the sheer emotional weight of the night finally caught up with my 70-year-old heart. I felt my knees hit the wet grass. Dad, stay with us. Audrey's medical training kicked in, her hands moving over me, but her voice sounded like it was miles away. As I lay there on the edge of my ruined empire, watching the flames dance in the reflection of my daughter's tears, I realized that I had reached the true rock bottom. I was dying. My house was gone. My enemy was fleeing with my fortune. And the worst part? I could see Silas's car headlights in the distance, speeding toward the airport. He was winning. What happened next changed everything. Because as my eyes began to close, I saw a black SUV pull out from the shadows of the trees, swerving directly into Silas's path. The collision was silent from where I lay, just a flash of metal and glass in the moonlight. "Who is that?" JJ asked, squinting into the dark. I didn't have the breath to tell him, but I knew the silhouette of the man stepping out of the SUV. It wasn't the police. It wasn't Jax's team. It was the one person Silas Vance had forgotten to account for. The one person who hated him even more than I did. I closed my eyes, the darkness finally taking me, but I wasn't afraid. Because for the first time in this entire nightmare, I wasn't the one fighting alone. I woke up to the rhythmic, sterile hum of a world made of plastic and oxygen. The ceiling was a flat, antiseptic white, and for a terrifying second, I thought I was back in that motel room, staring at the abyss. But the air here was different, clean, expensive, and filtered. I tried to move my hand, and a sharp tingle of IV needles reminded me that I was still tethered to the living. "Don't try to sit up, Dad. You've had a massive shock to the system." It was Audrey. She was sitting in a chair by the bed, her face pale, and etched with an exhaustion that no amount of coffee could mask. She looked older than she had 24 hours ago. The old money poise was gone, replaced by a raw, jagged vulnerability. She reached out and took my hand, her grip trembling. "Where are we?" I croaked, my voice sounding like it was being pulled through gravel. "A private clinic in North Stamford. Jax moved us here before the police could process the scene at the manor. He said the official record needs to show you're still missing or dead." She squeezed my hand, a sob catching in her throat. "I'm so sorry, Julian. I saw everything. The way Silas treated you, the way he was willing to let us burn. I was so blind. I let him use my anger to poison the only thing that was real." I looked past her. JJ was standing by the window, staring out at the trees. When he heard my voice, he turned. His eyes were red-rimmed. "He's gone, Dad. Silas." He was taken from the crash site before the ambulance arrived. The SUV that hit him, it wasn't a random accident. Someone snatched him. I closed my eyes, the memory of the black SUV flashing in my mind, the silhouette of the driver. I knew that shape. It wasn't a ghost, and it wasn't a stranger. It was the one variable Silas Vance hadn't calculated because he had spent a decade convincing the world she didn't exist. Sloane Kensington. I whispered. Audrey and JJ exchanged a confused look. "Who is Sloane Kensington?" "The reason Silas is so obsessed with the Sterling patents," I said, the clarity returning to my mind with the cold precision of a diamond-tipped drill. 20 years ago, Silas wasn't a lawyer. He was a junior engineer at Kensington Tech. Sloane was the CEO's daughter, a brilliant structural scientist. They were engaged, but then her father died in a boating accident. The company was liquidated, and Sloane was committed to a psychiatric facility in upstate New York. Silas walked away with her research the base code for the very thermal systems I eventually perfected. I looked at my children. I didn't know back then. I bought those patents from a holding company Silas controlled. I thought I was saving a failing tech firm. I didn't realize I was buying stolen goods from a man who had erased his own fiancée to get ahead. Silas didn't just want my money. He wanted to destroy the only man who could prove his entire career was built on a lie. "And you think she's the one who hit him?" JJ asked, his voice low. "I think she's the only person who hates him more than I do," I replied. A heavy knock at the door signaled Jax's arrival. He looked like he'd been through a war zone. His jacket was torn, his knuckles were barked raw, and he was carrying a sleek, silver laptop. He looked at Audrey and Jay, with a professional nod before turning to me. The manor is a total loss, Julian. The fire marshal is ruling it a catastrophic boiler failure. Silas's team did a good job of scrubbing the security footage before they fled, but they didn't account for the cloud backup I set up at the safe house. He set the laptop on my lap. The good news? The POA you signed is already being flagged. As soon as Silas's offshore accounts tried to pull from the Sterling Mercer Trust, the ghost ledger triggered. The money is frozen in a digital escrow. Silas can see the digits, but he can't touch a single cent. He's currently holding $1 billion key to a locked vault. And the bad news? I asked. The bad news is that the official news is still reporting you as a fugitive. Vivienne is in police custody. They're questioning her about the arson, and Silas's lawyers, the ones he left behind, are painting her as your co-conspirator. They're claiming you blew up the house to hide the embezzlement. I felt a surge of cold fury. Silas was still winning the PR war. He was a ghost, Sloane Kensington had him, and my wife, the woman who had betrayed me but didn't deserve to die in a cage, was being used as his final scapegoat. "We need to move," I said, reaching for the IV line. "Dad, no," Audrey protested. "You need rest. Your heart." "My heart is fine, Audrey. It's my legacy that's flatlining." I ripped the tape from my arm, the sting a welcome distraction from the internal ache. "Jax, where is Sloane taking him?" I tracked the SUV to an old industrial park in Bridgeport. It's an abandoned foundry, my family's old territory. It's off the grid, no cameras, no police patrols. If she's got him there, he's not coming out with a lawyer. I looked at Jay. "Jay, you want to be a disruptor, son? You want to see how the world really works when the silk ties come off?" JJ stood taller, his jaw set in a way that reminded me of my own father. "Tell me what to do." "We're going to use the mot trembamwe born do la million," I said. "Not to hide and not to buy lawyers. We're going to buy the one thing Silas Vance thinks is his greatest weapon: information." I didn't know it yet, but the next 3 hours would involve the most expensive digital assault in the history of New England. I had Jax contact a shadow board, a group of high-level hackers and forensic accountants who lived in the corners of the internet my grandfather's ghost ledger had been designed to fund. While the world thought I was a broken old man, I sat in that hospital bed and authorized a my $1 million bounty for the unedited Kensington tech files. Within 40 minutes, we had them. It turned out Silas hadn't just stolen the patents. He had forged the commitment papers that put Sloane Kensington in that asylum. He had bribed doctors, paid off judges, and systematically erased a human being. But Sloane hadn't stayed erased. She had spent 10 years planning her return, and now she had the man who had stolen her life. "Jax, get the car," I said, swinging my legs over the side of the bed. "And Audrey, I need you to go to the police station. Take the digital forensics of the deepfake video. Take the Kensington files. And tell the district attorney that Julian Sterling is ready to turn himself in, but only after he delivers the real criminal." "You're going to the foundry," she said, her eyes wide with fear. "Julian, if Sloane kills him, you're an accessory. She's not going to kill him," I said, a dark, cold certainty settling over me. "She's going to do something much worse. She's going to make him watch as his world is dismantled, just like he did to me." The drive to Bridgeport was a blur of gray, rainy streets and flashing neon. I sat in the back of Jax's sedan, the leather-bound ledger open in my lap. I realized then that my grandfather Alistair hadn't been a villain for ruining the Harrison and Vance families. He had been a man who saw the rot in their foundations and decided to clear the land. He had left me the money so I could do the same. We pulled up to the Bridgeport foundry, a massive, skeletal structure of rusted steel and broken glass. It looked like the carcass of a dead god. A single black SUV sat near the entrance, its engine still ticking as it cooled. "Stay back," Jax whispered, drawing his weapon. "No," I said, stepping out into the rain. "This is a Sterling matter." I walked into the foundry, the air smelling of wet iron and ancient soot. In the center of the vast, hollow space, a single work light illuminated a scene that looked like a painting of purgatory. Silas Vance was strapped to a heavy steel chair, the very kind of chair I had been tied to in my own library. His face was a mask of bruises and blood, his silk jacket shredded. Standing in front of him was a woman who looked like a shadow made flesh. She was thin, her hair a shock of silver white, but her eyes were twin lasers of pure, unadulterated coldness. She held a heavy industrial wrench in one hand and a tablet in the other. "Julian," she said without looking back, "you're late. I thought the heart attack would have slowed you down more." "Sloane," I said, stopping 10 feet away. "I see you've been busy." "He's a coward, Julian," she said, finally turning to face me. He cried the whole way here. He offered me 50 million, then 100. He doesn't understand that you can't buy back a decade of a life spent in a padded cell. I have the files, Sloan, I said, holding up the laptop. The original Kensington Code, the forged commitment papers, the bribery trail. It's all going to the DA right now. Silas looked up, his eyes bulging with terror. Julian, help me. She's crazy. She's going to kill me. I'll give you everything back. The manor, the company, the money, I'll sign a confession. You already signed a confession, Silas, I said, stepping into the light. The POA you forced me to sign? I didn't sign Julian Sterling. I signed Alistair Sterling, my grandfather's name. In the state of Connecticut, a signature with a deceased person's name on a document involving their own trust is an automatic, bad faith trigger. The document is void, but the intent is a felony. I looked at Sloan. The police are 10 minutes away. Audrey is with the DA. If you kill him now, you go back to a cell. But if you let him live, he spends the rest of his life as the man who was outsmarted by an unstable woman and a senile old man. That's a fate worse than death for a man like Silas. Sloan looked at Silas, then at the wrench in her hand. She smiled a slow, terrifying expression. You're right, Julian. Dead men don't feel the shame. She dropped the wrench. It hit the concrete floor with a clang that echoed like a funeral bell. But as the sirens began to wail in the distance, a new sound cut through the air. A low, rhythmic thrumming. Not from the foundry, but from above. A helicopter was descending toward the roof. He's not going to jail, Julian, Jax shouted, running into the light. Look at the tail number. That's a private extraction team. Silas had a backup. Silas started to laugh, a bloody, hysterical sound. Did you really think I only had one plan? My associates don't care about the law, Julian. They care about the patents. And as long as I'm alive, they'll keep me safe. The roof of the foundry groaned as the helicopter hovered, a rope ladder dropping through the skylight. 2 men in tactical gear slid down, their weapons leveled at us. Get him up, one of the men barked. I looked at Silas. He was being unstrapped, a look of triumphant malice returning to his battered face. He was going to get away. He was going to vanish into the clouds with the secrets of my life's work. But then, I felt the weight of my grandfather's ledger in my hand. I remembered the note in the margin. The long game. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the burner phone. I didn't call the police. I pressed a single button on the Ghost Ledger app. Silas. I yelled over the roar of the helicopter. Check your watch. Silas paused, his foot on the ladder. He looked at his high-end digital watch. The screen wasn't showing the time. It was showing a countdown. Bah. Hi. Mort. Suddenly, every electronic device in the foundry, the helicopter's navigation, the tactical team's radios, and Silas's own encrypted phone erupted in a shower of sparks. The helicopter engine sputtered and died, the rotors grinding to a halt as it tilted precariously on the rusted roof. An EMP? Silas screamed, falling back to the floor. Not an EMP, I said, walking toward him as the tactical team scrambled to fix their dead equipment. Sterling reset. My grandfather didn't just build buildings, Silas. He built the very foundations of the Sterling Mercer power grid. And I just turned off the lights. The foundry plunged into total darkness, save for the blue glow of my burner phone. But in that darkness, I heard a sound that made my skin crawl. It wasn't the police, and it wasn't Sloan. It was the sound of the foundry floor, opening. What is that? JJ's voice came from the shadows. I realized then that the foundry wasn't just a ruin. It was the entrance to something else. Something my grandfather had hidden beneath the earth for 70 years. And as the ground beneath Silas Vance began to slide away, I realized that the revenge I had planned was nothing compared to what the Sterling family had been waiting to do. The mechanical groan that rose from the belly of the foundry was a sound from another century, a deep, rhythmic grinding of rusted iron gears and heavy chains that vibrated through the soles of my shoes. As the Sterling reset plunged the upper world into a digital blackout, the ancient, analog heart of the Blackwood foundry began to beat. The floor didn't just slide away, it spiraled downward, a massive circular platform retracting to reveal a subterranean chamber that had been sealed since the Eisenhower administration. Silas Vance, caught mid-climb on the rope ladder of the now-dead helicopter, screamed as the ground vanished beneath him. The tactical team, blinded by the darkness and the sudden loss of their night vision gear, scrambled for purchase on the receding edge. Silas lost his grip, falling 20 feet through the darkness. He landed with a sickening thud on the cold stone of the lower level, a cry of agony echoing up the shaft. "Stay close to me," I shouted to Audrey and JJ, grabbing a heavy brass flashlight from Jax's belt. I clicked it on, the beam cutting through the dust-choked air like a sword. "Julian, what is this place?" Jax asked, his gun leveled at the darkness below. Even He, a man who knew the city's secrets, looked unsettled. "The bedrock of the Empire," I replied. My grandfather didn't trust the banks, Jax. He didn't even trust the government. He believed that the only way to protect a legacy was to bury it in a place that didn't exist on any map. We descended a narrow, iron spiral staircase that clung to the damp brick walls. At the bottom, the air was cold enough to turn our breath into ghostly plumes. The space was cavernous, a cathedral of stone and steel, but it wasn't filled with gold bars or stacks of cash. It was filled with rows upon rows of industrial-sized filing cabinets and massive lead-lined trunks. Silas lay in a heap near the center of the room, clutching his leg. The fall had clearly broken his tibia. Bone was nearly breaking the skin, and he was gasping in shallow, panicked bursts. Sloane Kensington stood over him, the blue light of her own tablet illuminating her face like a vengeful spirit. She wasn't hitting him anymore. She was just watching him crawl. "You won't get away with this, Sterling," Silas hissed, though the bravado was leaking out of him along with the blood. "My associates, they're already tracking the helicopter. When they find out what you've done—" "Your associates are the reason I brought you down here, Silas," I said, walking toward him. I kicked away the tablet he was trying to reach. "You see, I've spent 40 years wondering why a man like you, with your intellect, was so obsessed with me. I thought it was greed. I thought it was the patents. But then I saw that name in the ledger. The Commodore. I walked over to one of the massive trunks and threw back the lid. Inside were hundreds of reels of microfilm and handwritten ledgers. My grandfather, Alistair, didn't just ruin the Harrison and Vance families because he was a shark, I said, my voice echoing in the stone chamber. He did it because their grandfathers were the architects of the New York Syndicate, a shadow cabal of financiers who used the Motngin Chin Trum Haimui Chin crash to buy up half the city's infrastructure for pennies. They were the ones who sent my father to a labor camp. They were the ones who killed my grandmother. Silas froze, his eyes darting to the files. "This isn't a bank, Silas. It's an archive. My grandfather spent 30 years gathering the evidence, the real deeds, the secret contracts, the records of every bribe and every accidental death used to build the families you represent. You weren't trying to rebuild the Vance legacy. You were hired to find this room and burn it." I looked at JJ and Audrey. They were standing by the crates, their faces illuminated by the flashlight. They were looking at documents that proved their entire aristocratic upbringing was funded by the spoils of a silent war. "The Mot Trumbamui born Dola million?" I said, turning back to Silas. "That wasn't for me. That was the trigger fund. It was designed to stay hidden until someone like you got close enough to the sterling heart to trip the wire. Every cent of that money was automatically used today to buy out the debt of the very men you work for. By the time the sun rises, the associates you're so afraid of won't own a single building in Manhattan." I didn't know it yet, but the true reversal wasn't about the money. It was about the look of total, soul-crushing realization on Silas Vance's face. He hadn't just lost the game. He realized he had been playing for the wrong team his entire life. He was a pawn who thought he was a king, and I had just flipped the board. "You can't do that," Silas whimpered. "The legal filings. The boards will never approve." "I don't need a board's approval when I hold the physical evidence of their treason," I said, pointing to the crates. "Jax, call the U.S. Attorney's Office. Not the local boys Silas bought. The Federal Task Force on Racketeering. Tell them I have the Commodore files." "Julian, wait," Sloane Kensington said, her voice sharp. She stepped forward, her eyes fixed on Silas. "He still has the codes, the decryption for my father's research. He locked the servers before he left the manor. If he goes to jail now, 20 years of scientific progress dies with him." I looked at Silas. He saw a flicker of hope in Sloane's demand. He tried to straighten his tie, a pathetic reflex of a dying man. "She's right, Julian. You need me. I'm the only one who can unlock the thermal patents. Without me, the Sterling Development Group is just a pile of bricks and debt. Let me go, and I'll give her the codes." I looked at Silas, then at Sloane. I saw the pain in her eyes, the decade of her life that had been stolen. And then I looked at my children. They were waiting to see what I would do. Would I be the man who made a deal with the devil to save his company? Or would I be the man my grandfather hoped I'd become? I don't need your codes, Silas, I said. What? Julian, you're throwing away billions, Silas screamed. No, I said, pulling a small, rusted key from my pocket, the one that had been hidden in the spine of the leather ledger. I'm reclaiming the source. I walked to the very back of the chamber, where a single, heavy safe was built into the bedrock itself. I inserted the key and turned it. The door swung open with a heavy thud. Inside was a single, hand-drawn blueprint on vellum paper, dated Mutngin Chintram Bornwelum. My grandfather was a merchant marine, Silas. But he was also a genius. He didn't buy your fiancée's research. He funded it in secret through her father. This isn't your code. It was never your code. This is the original analog blueprint for the Stirling thermal system, the one your father stole a copy of, but could never quite get to work because he didn't have the final calculations. I handed the vellum to Sloane. She took it, her fingers trembling as she traced the lines. This is it, she whispered. The missing variable. The one Silas could never figure out. I turned back to Silas, who looked like he had been struck by lightning. You're a fraud, Silas. From top to bottom. You're not a visionary. You're just a scavenger who got lucky. The sound of heavy boots echoed from the stairs. The federal team had arrived, led by Audrey's contact. They moved with the surgical efficiency of a team that had been briefed for a high-value extraction. They didn't even look at me. They went straight for Silas. As they hauled him up, his broken leg dragging on the stone, Silas looked at me one last time. There was no rage left, only a cold, hollow emptiness. Why, Julian? He rasped. You could have had it all. We could have ruled this city together. Because I already have everything I need, I said, putting my arms around Audrey and JJ. And none of it fits in a bank account. But as they led Silas away, Jack stepped close to me, his face grim. Julian, we have a problem. The police just finished processing Vivienne at the station. She didn't just confess to the fraud. She gave them something else. Something she said she'd been hiding for 30 years. I felt a cold prickle of dread. What? She said that Julian Jr. isn't your biological son, Julian. She said he's the son of Silas Vance's father. The world tilted. I looked at JJ, my son, the boy I had taught to stargaze, the man who was currently holding me up. He hadn't heard Jack's yet, but he saw the look on my face. Dad? What is it? JJ asked. The betrayal I thought I had conquered suddenly sprouted a new, poisonous limb. If JJ wasn't my son, the Stirling Heritage Trust was legally void. The Mutrumba Muy Borndola Million, the company, the archives, they would all revert to the nearest living blood relative. And according to the lineage of the Vance family, that relative was currently being loaded into a federal transport. I looked at the ghost ledger in my hand. I had spent the night fighting for my legacy, only to find out that the very foundation of that legacy might be a lie. Silas Vance wasn't just my enemy. He might be my son's true family. Jack's, I whispered, the weight of 70 years finally threatening to crush me. Don't say a word. To anyone. It's too late, Julian, Jack said, looking toward the stairs. The DA is already here with the DNA warrant. Vivienne didn't just talk. She provided a sample from the manor's hairbrushes before the fire. I looked at my son, the boy who had just risked his life to save me from a fire. I didn't care about the blood, but the law did. And Silas Vance, even in handcuffs, was smiling. He had heard. He knew. The long game, Julian? Silas yelled from the stairs, his voice a jagged saw of triumph. I told you I was playing a different game. I stood in the center of my grandfather's secret cathedral, surrounded by millions of dollars and 1,000 secrets, and for the first time in my life, I felt truly, utterly alone. I had won the war, but the cost was the one thing I couldn't buy back, my family's identity. But then, JJ stepped forward. He didn't look at the files or the money. He looked straight at me. I don't care what the paper says, Dad, JJ said, his voice as steady as a rock. I'm a Stirling. And Stirlings don't lose. He took the ledger from my hand and walked toward the DA. What are you doing, JJ? I asked, my voice failing. I'm finishing the reset, he said. I didn't know it yet. But the final twist wasn't about who JJ's father was. It was about what my grandfather had hidden in the very first page of the ledger. A secret that would make Vivienne's confession the greatest mistake of her life. I watched JJ walk away from me, his silhouette tall and firm against the flickering light of the Federal Task Force's lanterns. He moved with a purpose I hadn't seen in him since he was a boy, a quiet strength that made my chest ache with a mixture of pride and terror. Silas Vance was still being hoisted up the iron stairs, his broken leg trailing, but he was laughing a jagged, hysterical sound that echoed off the damp stone walls. He thought he had found the ultimate silver bullet. He thought the blood in JJ's veins was the key that would unlock my grandfather's vault and hand him the kingdom. "The DNA doesn't lie, Julian," Silas screamed, his voice cracking as he reached the top of the stairs. "Vivienne knew. She always knew. You raised a Vance, and now a Vance is going to take every single brick you ever laid." I felt the air leave my lungs. I looked at Vivienne, who was being led away by two female officers. She wouldn't look at me. Her face was a mask of cold, exhausted spite. She had spent 35 years in my bed, holding a secret that she finally used to burn the world down around us. If it wasn't my son, the Sterling Heritage Trust would collapse. Under the Mot Ngin Chin Trum Born Mui Tarm Charter, the assets were legally bound to the direct biological line. If JJ was Silas's kin, the very money I'd used to fight back would belong to my enemy. I slumped against a lead-line trunk, my heart fluttering like a dying moth. Audrey was at my side in an instant, her hand on my pulse, her eyes searching mine with a desperate, clinical intensity. "Dad, don't listen to him. Silas is a manipulator. He's trying to kill you with a lie because he couldn't do it with a bullet. It's not just Silas, Audrey," I whispered, the cold of the underground chamber finally seeping into my soul. "It's your mother. She wouldn't play that card unless she knew it was an ace." Jax Blackwood stood near the center of the room, his gun holstered but his eyes fixed on the ledger JJ had handed to the district attorney. The DA, a man named Harrison Garrett, no relation to Vivienne's family, but a man with a reputation for being as unyielding as iron, was flipping through the first few pages of the Alistair Sterling ledger. He stopped at the very first page, the one I had missed in my haste to find the money. "Wait," Garrett said, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Everyone stop." He looked at the tactical team, then at the officers holding Vivienne. He walked toward me, the ledger held open. J. followed him, his face unreadable. "Mr. Sterling," Garrett said, looking me in the eye. "There is an addendum here. It's dated June Mui Bornth, Mut Ngin Chin Trum Born Mui Tarm, the same day the trust was finalized." I took the ledger with trembling fingers. I looked at my grandfather's handwriting. It was different here, not the cramped, business-like script of the ledgers, but a bold, sweeping hand. "To my grandson, Julian, or whoever holds this book in the hour of betrayal," the note began. "The men of the Harrison and Vance families believe that blood is the only currency. They believe that power is inherited through the womb and the name. They are wrong. A Sterling is not made of blood. A Sterling is made of the oath." I frowned, my eyes scanning the text. I knew the Vances would try to infiltrate our line. I saw the way Silas's father looked at your father's wife back in the day. I knew the rot would try to plant its seed in our garden. So, I structured the Heritage Trust, not by biology, but by acknowledgement of the patriarch. Under the laws of this trust, the heir is the one whom the current Sterling patriarch names in the presence of this book. Biology is a ghost. Purpose is the flesh. But then, my eyes hit the final paragraph, and I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the tempered evil. However, to ensure the Vance line never benefits from their treachery, I have included a paternity fraud clause. If any spouse ever attempts to claim the Sterling legacy through a contested bloodline, they forfeit every penny of their own standing. And should a DNA test prove that a Sterling heir was fathered by a Vance, the entire Vance estate, including all holdings of the Harrison-Vance partnership, is immediately forfeit to the Sterling Trust as reparations for the defilement of the line. I looked up at Silas, who was being held at the top of the stairs. He couldn't hear me, but he saw the change in my expression. "What does it say, Julian?" he yelled, his voice echoing. "What did the old man write?" "He wrote your death warrant, Silas," I said, my voice suddenly booming with a power I didn't know I still possessed. I looked at the district attorney. "Mr. Garrett, my son JJ is going to take that DNA test. Right now. In front of your medical team." "Dad, you don't have to do this," JJ said, stepping closer. J, I said, grabbing his hand. "Because I know the truth. Vivienne didn't just confess because she wanted to hurt me. She confessed because she thought it would save Silas. But she didn't realize that my grandfather Alistair was a man who played a game so long. It outlived him by 50 years. The next 2 hours were a blur of sterile swabs and quiet conversations. We stayed in the foundry, the federal team guarding the perimeter while a private lab authorized by the DA processed the samples in a mobile unit. The tension was a physical thing. a heavy weight that made every breath feel like a victory. Audrey sat with me, her head on my shoulder. JJ sat across from us, staring at his hands. Vivian sat in a separate police cruiser, her eyes fixed on the foundry doors. She was waiting for the moment Silas would be released, and her son would be named the King of Greenwich. Finally, the lab tech walked back in. He handed a sealed envelope to District Attorney Garrett. Garrett opened it, his eyes scanning the data. He looked at me, then at Vivian's cruiser, then up at the tactical team holding Silas. "The results are conclusive," Garrett said. "Julian Sterling Jr. is the Motrum biological son of Julian Sterling Sr." A silence fell over the foundry, so deep you could hear the rain hitting the roof 3 stories above. I looked at Vivian. Through the glass of the cruiser, I saw the moment her world collapsed. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She just emptied. The lie she had told the one she had spent decades preparing as her final weapon was just that. A lie. She had never cheated. She had never fathered a child with a Vance. She had simply lied about it at the very end, hoping the claim would be enough to trigger the legal chaos Silas needed to escape. She had cleared life on a bluff, and my grandfather had called it from the grave. But the real twist was yet to come. "There's something else," Garrett said, looking at the second report in his hand. "We ran Silas Vance's DNA against the Commodore Files records we found in the crates. Specifically, the records of the Motngin Chintrum Bornmuelum Harrison Vance merger." Garrett looked at Silas, who was now trembling. "Silas, your father wasn't a Vance. According to the private records of your own grandfather found in Alistair Sterling's archive, your father was the illegitimate son of a Sterling stable hand and a Harrison maid. You've spent your whole life trying to reclaim a legacy that wasn't yours, while fighting the very family that actually gave you life." The irony was a physical blow. Silas Vance, the man who obsessed over bloodlines and aristocratic revenge, was the descendant of the people he looked down upon most. He wasn't a shark. He was a mistake in the ledger that he had spent his life trying to erase. "No," Silas whimpered, his head falling back against the stairs. "No, that's impossible. My father told me." "Your father lied to you to give you a reason to hate, Silas," I said, walking toward the stairs. I looked up at him, not with rage, but with a profound, bone-deep pity. "Just like Vivienne lied to JJ, the hate was the only thing you had. And now, you don't even have that." As they hauled Silas Vance away into the back of a federal van, the sun began to peek through the broken skylights of the foundry. The Sterling reset was complete. The blackouts were ending. The city was waking up to a world where Silas Vance was a ghost and Julian Sterling was a legend. The months that followed were a quiet, methodical reconstruction. The Motrum Bamwe Borndola million from my grandfather's account didn't go toward mansions or yachts. I used it to establish the Alistair Sloan Foundation for Ethical Innovation. We bought back the Kensington patents and handed them to Sloan, who spent the next 2 years revolutionizing the very industry Silas had tried to steal from her. Vivienne was sentenced to 10 years for her role in the fraud and the attempted arson at the manor. She refused to see me, which was a mercy I accepted with a heavy heart. I didn't hate her. I just couldn't remember the woman I had loved. She had become a stranger in a familiar face. Audrey returned to her clinic, but now she was the head of a citywide initiative for affordable medical care, funded by the Sterling Trust. She found a peace she had never known in the high society circles of Greenwich. And JJ? He didn't take over the Sterling Development Group. He liquidated it. "The name should rest, Dad," he told me one evening as we sat on the porch of a modest beach house in Rhode Island, the only property I kept. "We don't need to build skyscrapers to prove we exist. We just need to be Sterlings." He started a small architectural firm that focused on rebuilding low-income housing in the very neighborhoods where I had started my career. He was a disruptor after all, but he was disrupting poverty instead of boards. I'm 72 now. My heart is a bit slower, and I walk with a cane I bought in London, but I've never felt lighter. I spend my mornings walking the beach with Jax Blackwood, who has officially retired from the shadows to become my head of security and my closest friend. We talk about the old days, but mostly, we talk about the tides. I realize that my grandfather didn't leave me that money to make me rich. He left it to make me free. He knew that the greatest revenge isn't watching your enemies suffer. It's living a life they can no longer touch. Last week, JJ brought his new daughter to visit. He named her Alistair. As I held her, her small hand gripping my thumb, I looked at the leather-bound ledger sitting on the coffee table. The first page was still open. "A Sterling is not made of blood. A sterling is made of the oath. I looked at my granddaughter, her eyes bright and curious, and I knew that the storm was finally over. The sterling name wasn't a brand, and it wasn't a bank account. It was a promise that even when the world tries to bury you, you can always find your way back to the light. Silas Vance is still in a federal prison in Pennsylvania. I heard he spends his days in the library, reading books on genealogy, still trying to find a way to prove he belongs. I hope he finds what he's looking for. But as for me, I've found everything I ever needed. I'm Julian Sterling. I was broken, I was betrayed, and I was left for dead. But I didn't just survive the storm. I became it.